Chapter 6. The Wedge. The newspapers and radio shows were full of comment after Pope John Paul II sent a message to a meeting of the Papal Academy of Sciences in 1996 that seemed to endorse evolution. As usual, journalists interpreted this event strictly according to the inherit the win stereotype. For a few days, the press portrayed the Pope as a relatively enlightened religious leader who was willing to adjust his faith to the scientific facts, in contrast to obstinate Protestant fundamentalists who continued to fight for a literal interpretation of the first chapters of Genesis. The stories took for granted that a reasonably broad-minded religion can coexist peacefully with evolutionary science. Reporters forgot overnight that Richard Dawkins had just been touring the United States, carrying the more accurate message that Darwinism denies absolutely that a creator is responsible for our existence. In fact, the Pope's message was not quite as advertised. The Roman Catholic Church long ago approved evolution as a scientific hypothesis worthy of investigation. On the other hand, the Catholic Church had consistently opposed materialism, as any genuine Christian church must. John Paul II's statement continued this tradition. Although he remarked that the general principle of evolution had been supported by various independent lines of evidence, he also said that it seems there are several theories of evolution, rather than only one, because there is substantial disagreement over both the mechanism and the philosophy. Far from endorsing the materialist understanding of evolution that dominates contemporary science, the Pope pronounced that theories of evolution, which, in accordance with the philosophies inquiring them, consider the spirit as emerging from the forces of living matter, or as a mere epiphoneum of this matter, are incompatible with the trust about man. As usual, Microphone Man kept the Pope's real position from reaching the public by reporting only the soundbite. Pope endorses evolution. To be fair to the reporters, the Pope invited that kind of media treatment. He chose to state his critical reservations in cautious language in the middle of a document whose central theme was conciliatory towards evolutionary scientists, most of whom do not acknowledge that there is any difference between science and materialism. If he had wanted to draw a line in the sand, the Pope could have said bluntly in his first paragraph that evolution, as understood by scientists like Richard Dawkins and Carl Sagan, is based on materialist philosophy and hence incompatible with the truth about both God and humankind. If he had done that, newspapers would probably have headlined the story, "Pope Attacks Science," and the stories would have featured interviews with liberal professors at Catholic universities expressing concern about the Pope's increasing rigidity and lecturing him that the Bible is not a science textbook. Accompanying editorials would have reminded their readers that the Church persecuted Galileo centuries before, and implied that vigilance will be necessary to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen again. Even a pope can be confined in a stereotype. It is understandable that the Vatican chose to emphasize the conciliatory side of the papal statement. Like most Christian leaders, the Pope doesn't want to spend his time and energies arguing with scientists about their theories. He wants to give science its due and move on to the spiritual matters that primarily concern him. If currently accepted theories are true, they will prevail, and if they are not true, they will eventually be discarded. So it may seem prudent to make peace with evolution, provided that scientists are willing to interpret the theory in a way that doesn't rule out fundamental Christian doctrines, like the resurrection or the creation of humankind in the image of God. The trouble with the conciliatory strategy, however, is that it papers over a fundamental difference in worldviews that can't be compromised. Scientific materialists genuinely believe that materialism and science are inseparable, that the realm of objective reality belongs entirely to science, and that belief in a supernatural creator is a holdover from the past that has no place in a rational mind. Religion is acceptable to materialists only as long as it stays in the realm of the imagination and makes no independent claims about objective reality. Creation must be a human way of thinking about what evolution has accomplished, and the resurrection must be an event that occurred only in the minds of the disciples. Many liberal Christian leaders have surrendered on these terms and have even become proponents of naturalism. Fortunately, the Pope knows better than to do that. In their own way, all Christian parents, teachers, students have to deal with the same problem the Pope faced. The culture tells us that we have two alternatives. We can accept evolution, as the scientists understand the term, which means that we implicitly accept naturalism and materialism, even if we pretend otherwise. Alternatively, we can reject evolution, in which case Microphone Ma'am will stereotype us as pre-modern fundamentalists who insist on every detail of Genesis, regardless of the evidence. Should we fight, or should we accommodate on the best terms we can get from the materialist? If we choose to accommodate, we can take some advantage of the statement of science organizations, which do say, although not very convincingly, that science does not deal with religious questions or deny the existence of God. These half-hearted disclaimers create some wiggle room, especially considering that the more limited definition of evolution may be perfectly consistent with Christianity, including even fundamentalist Christianity. Evolution within the species is as much a biblical doctrine as a scientific one. For the Bible taught us, long before modern science, that all the different races of humans descended from a common human ancestor. Finch beak variation in no way denies that only God can make a bird. We can even pretend, as some teachers do, that all the scientists are saying is that all living things are related, and that a certain amount of natural variation occurs in nature. We may know that Darwinian evolution is actually saturated with materialist philosophy, but why not cooperate with the Darwinist by shrouding this fact in ambiguous words? Perhaps we can just say that we accept evolution as a scientific theory about how God created, and then drop the subject and go on to more pleasant matters. As a senator famously said during the unwinnable Vietnam War, why don't we just declare victory and go home? One answer to that question is that a shallow reconciliation of science and religion leaves our young people open to materialist indoctrination when they go away to college and learn there what evolution really means. Many readers of this book will have seen the videotape of the debate I had with Cornell professor William Provine at Stanford University. Provine has told me that his father was a Christian minister who tried to reconcile Christianity and evolution through process theology, the process being that God is evolving along with the world. When Provine studied evolution in graduate school and learned that it is a strictly materialist process that has no purpose or goal, he discarded the religious baggage and has been a dedicated atheist ever since. The same has happened to many others, although usually less dramatically. As students grow more and more accustomed to assuming materialism and naturalism in their academic work, the concept of creation by God gradually tends to become less real to them. It's not so much that any single finding undermines their faith, rather the day-to-day practice of thinking in naturalist terms about academic subjects makes it awkward to think differently when it comes to religion. Young intellectuals may insist for years that they are still believers, but then one day they wake up to realize that their beliefs have been emptied of its content, and they either throw away the empty shell or fill it with something else. That's why every mainstream Christian institution is beset from within these days by people who want the church to turn away from the old business of sin and salvation and devote its energies to whatever social causes are currently fashionable in the secular world. The reason shallow reconciliation doesn't work is that the specific conclusion of evolutionary science are only part of the problem, and the lesser part. God could work through evolution or natural selection, and in limited respects he does. The greater problem is that the modernist science protects its grand theory of evolution by starting with the basic assumption that God is out of the picture, and by sticking to that assumption throughout every discouragement. When people are taught for years on end that good thinking is naturalist thinking, and that bringing God into the picture only leads to confusion and error, they have to be pretty dense not to get the point that God must be an illusion. This doesn't necessarily mean that they become atheists, but they are likely to think about God in a naturalist way, as an ideal in the human mind rather than as a reality that nobody can afford to ignore. Naturalistic thinking is as prevalent in the non-scientific departments of the universities, including departments of religious studies, as it is in the sciences. It is as rare for a history professor to assert in professional circles that the resurrection might really have happened, as it is for a biology professor to advocate intelligent design. Many literary professors have discarded the rationalism of science in favor of realistic philosophies like deconstruction. They have retained, all the more desperately, the naturalism that frees them from having to worry about what God might think about their abandonment of truth. In fact, many of them invoke Darwinism to challenge the ideal that there is such a thing as objective truth, or an objective difference between right and wrong. According to the very influential philosopher Richard Rorty, the ideal that one species of organisms is, unlike all the others, oriented not just towards its own increased prosperity, but towards truth, is as un-Darwinian as the ideal that every human being has a built-in moral compass, a conscience that swings free of both social history and individual luck. Rorty is absolutely right. Truth with a capital T is truth as God knows it. When God is no longer in the picture, there can be no truth, only conflicting human opinions. There also can be no sin. The consciousness of sin is that built-in moral compass Rorty rejects as illusionary. We can know something about what is useful for getting whatever we whatever we happen to want, but false beliefs have often been extremely useful. In fact, modernists frequently cite belief in God as a prime example of a falsehood that has been useful for advocating social unity or comforting people against the fear of death. The dream of modernists was that science would be an adequate substitute for truth. This is the case, however, only with matters like the ordinary law of physics, apples fall down, not up, which are subject to direct experimental testing. Very few really interesting propositions, like Darwinian microevolution, for example, can be tested so directly, or conclusively. With respect to these more elusive matters, scientific theories rely on elaborate reasoning and sophisticated interpretation, and rest on assumptions that are difficult or impossible to prove. At times, science can even seem to make a mockery of reality. The most impressive scientific theory of contemporary times is quantum mechanics, which is some interpretations say that the exact location of a particle at a given time depends on whether somebody happens to be looking. Quantum mechanics unquestionably works, but whether and in what sense it can be said to be true has just about everyone baffled. The result of such common-sense-defying theories have been to encourage speculation that the observer makes the world, and even to foster the growth of intellectual movements that consider science itself to be only one way of interpreting the world. That speculation is the basis of what is called postmodernism, which has become a formidable movement in the humanities. Modernists believe in a universal rationality founded on science. Postmodernists believe in a multitude of different rationalities and consider science to be only one way of interpreting the world. In other words, modernists are rationalist, postmodernists are relativist. Relativism is particularly hard to avoid in the realm of value, because one of the basic modernist assumptions is that ought cannot be derived from is. Science may be able to tell us exactly how things happen, but it cannot tell us whether anything is bad or good, beautiful or ugly. Only humans, or God, can make moral or artistic judgments, and these judgments cannot be derived directly from the mere facts. History may be able to tell us that most societies have condemned they've condemned prostitution or homosexual behavior. But this fact cannot prove that such practices are wrong for us. After all, some of those same societies practice barbaric cruelties and condone slavery. Why shouldn't we toss tradition overboard and base our ethic and artistic standards on our own desires? It is no good for parents to try to protect their children from the influence of thinkers like Carl Sagan and Richard Dawkins, or Richard Rorty. The prominent modernist and postmodernist thinkers embody philosophical currents that permeate academia and the media at every level, in television series like Star Trek, for example. Even Christian college and seminary professors are bound to be influenced by the spirit of the times. To be successful in academic life is to be current with the fashionable thought from the most prestigious universities, and teachers can hardly help absorbing the way of thinking that they themselves have been taught. Protecting young people works only if it can be kept forever uninformed or unthinking, and that is a losing strategy in the long run. For that matter, it would be an unworthy strategy even if it were more successful. Jesus did not tell his disciples to form a protected community where they could shut out corrosive philosophies. He told them to go and make disciples of all nations. A faith that has to be protected behind walls is like a house built on sand. When the protection ceases, the faith collapses. Faith is confirmed by testing and validated by struggle in a world that gives a multitude of reasons for doubt. Instead of hiding our light under a bushel to protect it from the darkness, today we need to be more like the biblical man of Issachar, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. If we understand our own times, we will know that we should affirm the reality of God by challenging the domination of modernism and naturalism in the world of the mind. With the assistance of many friends, I have developed a strategy for doing this, and a major purpose of this book is to interest young people and persons with influence over young people in preparing themselves to take part in the great adventure we have begun. We call our strategy the wedge. A log is a seemingly solid object, but a wedge can eventually split it by penetrating a crack and gradually widening the split. In this case, the ideology of scientific materialism is the apparently solid log. The widening crack is the important but seldom recognized difference between the facts revealed by scientific investigation and the materialist philosophy that dominates the scientific culture. What happens when the facts cast doubt on the philosophy? Will scientists and philosophers allow materialism to be questioned, or will they rely on microphone man to suppress the facts and protect the philosophy? My own book, including this one, represent the sharp edge of the wedge. I had two goals in writing these books and in pursuing the program of public speaking that followed their publication. First, I wanted to make it possible to question naturalist assumptions in the secular academic community. Second, I wanted to redefine what is at issue in the creation-evolution controversy so that Christians and other believers in God could find common ground in the most fundamental issue, the reality of God as our true creator. Protestants will disagree on various issues among themselves. Catholics will disagree with Protestants, and observant Jews will disagree with Christians. What all these should agree on is that God, not some purposeless material process, is our true creator. Given that we inhabit a culture where intellectual leaders deny this fundamental fact, we should unite our energies to affirm the reality of God. After we have had that positive experience of unity and affirmation, we may be able to talk about the remaining points of disagreement, with renewed goodwill. This is the program I call Theist Realism. Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, which I described briefly in Chapter 5, represented the first broadening of the initial crack in the scientific modernism log. I first became acquainted with Behe when he wrote a letter to the editor of the journal Science, which had published a dismissive news article about me. I was naturally pleased to receive support from a reputable biochemist, and even more pleased that the letter was very well written. Subsequently, friends who were interested in promoting my ideals arranged an academic conference at Southern Methodist University, to which they invited 10 scientists and philosophers, including Behe, to discuss the relationship between evolutionary science and philosophical naturalism. Behe presented a paper on proteins at the conference and formed the ideal of writing a book to demonstrate that biologists who study cells and molecular systems constantly see examples of irreducibly complex systems that cannot have formed by Darwinian evolution. A major New York trade publisher, Free Press, brought out Behe's book, indicating that our small movement was breaking out of the Christian ghetto and into the cultural mainstream. The wedge is continuing to broaden. With the assistance of some generous donors and the staff of Christian Leadership Ministries, we put on a major conference on mere creation at Biola University in November of 1996. Approximately 200 persons attended, including scientists, philosophers, and prominent academic and financial supporters. Most were Christians, but the only requirement for attending was a willingness and ability to contribute to the theme of the conference, which was that the first steps for the 21st century science of origin is to separate materialist philosophy from empirical science. 16 persons gave papers, and of course there was extensive discussion about the next steps in our intellectual agenda. What is the next on the agenda? Scientifically, there is the question of how far the reconstruction of Darwinism is going to take us. We know that the Darwin mechanism doesn't work, and that complex biological systems never were put together by the combination of random mutations through natural selection. This is not a mere gap in the theory that is sound in other respects. It isn't just that the Darwinists have failed to prove a complete explanation. They've failed even to understand what needs to be explained. Their theory assumes that variations is all that they need to explain, and that the accumulation of small variations over immense amounts of times can produce complex organisms from simple beings. That is why they think that finch beak variation illustrates the process that creates birds in the first place. Once the problems of informational content and irreducible complexity are out on the table in plain view, well-informed people are going to be amazed that scientists took so long to see that random mutation is not an informational creator, and that the Darwin mechanism is therefore irrelevant to the real problem of biological creation. A few scientific materialists are aware of this, and they hope to rescue the situation by discovering new information creating laws of physics and chemistry. Good luck to them. But the prospects are about as promising as the prospect of finding new laws of ink and paper that can create Shakespeare's plays. Granted that the materialist mechanism has to be discarded, what does this imply for what scientists call the fact of evolution, the concept that all organisms share a common ancestor? Universal common ancestry is as much a product of materialist philosophy as is the mutation selection mechanism. Consider the proposition that a single ancestral bacterium gave birth to distant descendants as diverse as trees, insects, and birds. If materialism is true, then universal common ancestry virtually has to be true also. The only materialist alternative is that life arose from non-living chemicals many separate times. And this seems not only improbable, but inconsistent with the observable fact that all living organisms share a common biochemistry. Life seems to have arisen from a single source, and if materialism is true, that source must have been a material ancestor. Put aside the materialism, however, and the common ancestral thesis is as dubious as the Darwinian mechanism. There is no known process by which a bacterial species can evolve the immense complexity of plants and animals. In fact, there's only a beginning of an understanding of what that complexity involves. There is no fossil history of single-cell organisms changing step by step into complex plants and animals. On the contrary, the major groups of animals all appear suddenly in the rocks of the Cambrian era, and no new groups appear thereafter. High school textbooks either fail to mention this fundamental fact of the fossil records, or they refer to it so obliquely that students don't see the implications. The fossil problems are only the beginning, however, because evidence for embryological and genetics is adding to the difficulties. This is not the place to develop the scientific ideals further, My purpose here is just to give a hint of the excitement that animated the scientists and philosophers who attended the Mere Creation Conference. The British scientist materialist J.B. Haldane wrote many years ago, "My own suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose." For some obscure reason, Darwinists like to quote that statement, although Darwinism asserts that the realm of life is not queerer than we can suppose, but at bottom very simple and commonsensical. All it takes to make a world of living things, according to the theory, is variation, natural selection, changing environments, and long periods of time. But that is the 19th century science, and it won't survive the opening of Darwin's black box. When biology finally has its quantum revelation, our view of life and its origin will change profoundly. Even more exciting than the scientific part of the theist realism agenda, at least to me, is the new understanding of rationality that it promises. This is the subject of my book, Reasoning in the Balance. Materialists tell us, incredibly, that the universe can be rational only if it is a product of impersonal laws, and not if it is the creation of a supreme mind. Materialists tend to think the only alternative to materialism is some form of primitive superstition, where science would be impossible because all events would be the product by the whims of capricious gods. This is nonsense, of course. Intelligent design does not mean unintelligent chaos. Computers and space rockets are designed, but they work according to law-like principles. The real objection scientific materialism have to design is that the designer would be something outside of science and hence not subject to human control. The attraction of a materialist universe is that it feeds the imperialism of science by seeming to promise that everything can, in principle, be understood and controlled by science. There is an immense price to be paid for this illusion that can have a theory of everything, however. There can be no science of value, or of beauty, or of goodness. The whole realm of value is left to the subjective imagination, with deconstructive consequences that we can see all around us. Eventually, materialist philosophy undermines the reliability of the mind itself, and hence even the basis for science. The true foundation of rationalism is not found in particles and impersonal laws, but in the mind of the Creator who formed us in His image. Probably many readers of this book feel that pursuing the intellectual program of theist realism, or even completely understanding it, is beyond them. No matter if it is, nearly everyone knows some young person who has the necessary gifts. I find as time goes by that my greatest satisfaction comes not from the work I can do myself, but from the accomplishments of younger people to whom I have given encouragement and for whom I have opened doors. If you know a gifted young person, help him or her to see the vision. Those who are called to it won't need any further encouragement. Once they have seen their calling, you had better step out of the way, because you won't be able to stop them, even if you try.